Do you think that belief in magic is on the rise today?
I would say at least it doesn't show a precipitous decline anyway. So, I think that there was this assumption built into a broad spectrum of sociological theory, figures associated, for instance, with, the canon of sociology, Max Weber perhaps being the most famous, was often interpreted to have said, and I think the reading of Weber is wrong, but was often interpreted as to have imagined that over time people would get more rational and would believe less in magic. And as far as the sociology goes, the evidence doesn't bear it out, at least in the period of which we have good evidence. But what has happened is definitely changing meanings about what magic might mean. And there may be local variations, ups and downs, but I wouldn't say that magic has vanished. And there are people using that word in a more positive way than they have at other points in the past. So, depending on what time scale of history we're talking about. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe I'm approaching this in a too roundabout way. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. But we'll
go
find our feet as we get
on.
into the rhythm of the interview. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, what do you mean by approaching it in a more positive way? It's interesting that you kind of say it's not really like particularly high at the moment, or at least it's sometimes it's also like kind of hidden, so it doesn't go under the name of magic, but it's like you can kind of call things. So what I noticed, for example, I'm an economist, studying a PhD, and kind of as in a lot of science, it's kind of it says it's scientific and rational, but then underlying it, it's kind of like a lot of superstition, a lot of things like this, particularly in politics as well. So I mean, tell me a bit more about then belief in magic in
Yeah.
the
I
world
mean,
today.
well, so what I would say is that so there are a couple of things that are sort of packed into your question that I'll try and sort of unpack in different ways. One of them is there are questions about rationality and what is it rational and not rational to believe, and a lot of that is depends on things like one's sources of information, what one takes to be epistemic authorities. For instance, there's been a large breakdown of trust in established sources of knowledge in especially the last decade and much of the first world. So, you get anti-vax conspiracies and what have you. That's a question, that's not so much a question of rationality as it is a question of trust or a question of authority. And that's definitely changed. There's another question about how basically rational people are. And I think people are approximately everywhere, depending on how you define it, roughly the same amount rational, which is to say, not that rational. So it takes a lot of practice, a lot of philosophy classes, a lot of, let's say, science classes to learn to think in a particularly narrowly rational way. But most humans are not very good at certain things like statistics, for instance. Default tests where you try and get people to test their statistical intuitions, is Jim, more likely to be a beekeeper, or is he more likely to be a communist beekeeper, or whatever? People make very basic mistakes about probability. We just don't think in probabilistic terms without a lot of good training. And so I think in general, so one of the things that's going on is that today people have less trust in certain kinds of epistemic authorities, and that makes them more open to certain kinds of, let's call them conspiracy theories or what have you. But another issue is that we were never so much that rational to begin with, and some of our trust in epistemic authorities was variously misplaced. And within various disciplines, like your own economics, there was a notion of, and this is gonna, probably sound quite dated, but there was a notion of a kind of homo economicus, posited by people basically in the long legacy of Smith, who tended to imagine that that humans were rational choice thinking individuals, that we made ends means rational calculations, that rational choice theory was the best way to explain markets, individual behavior that led up to market behavior, that markets were guided by a quote unquote invisible hand when people were operating selfishly, that most people were basically selfish, and all these other things that were sort of built into descriptions of epistemic agents. And already more than a decade ago, really by the financial 2008 financial crash, a lot of those presuppositions about what it meant to be human and what it meant to be an ordinary thinking subject were profoundly challenged. And one of those was this idea that this kind of irrationality that was foisted onto people in the name often of the free market, but also as a sort of description of a human, of a posit built into economics, just turned out to not be very accurate. Yeah, and I could say another point about, but I'll make one economics point, and then I'll open it back up to you again. But if you even so, if you look at things like where people spend their money, you would note that things like material that is often flagged as magic, so New Age publications, the fortune telling, psychic services of one sort or another, that stuff is huge. And in fact, there's some evidence that has even grown since the period of 2008, such that according to one study, fortune-telling services are roughly comparable to online dating in their economic impact in the United States and Great Britain. So all that is to say, if you think of those things as magic, and again, we can hedge our categories in one way or another depending on what we're trying to capture, the basic evidence seems to suggest that a lot of people are at least willing to pay money for a whole range of activities that are like, fortune-telling and, crystal healing and certain kinds of magical publications. Yeah.
When you say that kind of linked to this kind of belief. So, for example, conspiracy theories as well. So yeah, on the one hand, literal services in kind of magic, and we can, depends on what we mean by magic, but it kind of, all of this permeating in our culture kind of reminds me of decline in religion and what that kind of does, because I guess it's, as we move away from religion in many respects in a secular culture, one would kind of think you wouldn't get as much as this, right? If the shift is from religion to like more rationalism, right? But if kind of, as we've been talking about, there's not like some thing we can just sort of employ and be more rational, right? And then instantly understand statistics, right? There's still some way in which innately it's actually kind of difficult to understand. So there's gonna continue to be demand for fortune telling, maybe, and maybe even kind of, and sometimes I think maybe even more, like religion kind of can house these kinds of things. Like you can kind of get a mediation of these different ways of understanding the world beyond just the material. And then if kind of that goes away, it's sort of like, whoa, what do we kind of do now? And people go their own different ways, but it's not like that underlying, I don't know what, I don't even want to call it, to be honest. Like it's like what instinct, the religious, some instinct for the supernatural sort of, but yeah.
Yeah, so I would push into that in two ways. One of the books that I've written is a book called The Myth of Disenchantment, which I'll mention to your listeners or viewers. I don't know if I assume we're going to be visual. And in that book, I tried to disaggregate two phenomena: secularization and "quote unquote" disenchantment. Either of these could be defined in different ways, but secularization is often measured by things like church attendance or people belonging to, let's say, established religions. And by certain metrics, that number has gone down in various parts of the world in the last 20 or 30 years. There are different parts of the world have different time periods, etc. But people in the past had thought, exactly as you posited a little bit earlier, people, that as secularization increased, belief in strange things would go down. But so secularization was supposed to be correlated with disenchantment. But part of the argument in that book is that those things are uncorrelated, at the very least, if not inversely correlated. So what tends to happen is, as people stop going to church, they develop less trust in their particular religious authorities. According to at least broad sociological data, there's an increase rather than a decrease in paranormal beliefs. So, for instance, and there are different ways to define paranormal beliefs, but there was a kind of fun poll, I now forget, maybe it was Ipsos or something, a few years ago in the UK that was reported on, and it was said something like more Britons believe in ghosts than God or something like that. And it may have been a little bit overplayed, but you can see that looking across a range of European countries and North America, that as people report a decrease in belief in organized religion, maybe even a decrease in belief in God, there's an increase in belief in things like ghosts and spirits and quote unquote magic. So part of what's going on, though, is a kind of belief fragmentation, so that what gets housed under the category of religion versus housed under the category of magic is slippery. Or under the category of science, for that matter. But it's more so between, let's say, magic and religion for the kind of beliefs that we're talking about. So questions about so all that is to say that there's been a changing landscape of belief, and what we'd, rather than experiencing a kind of disenchantment in which people develop a stripped down belief in a particular kind of mechanical a notion of cosmology in a particular statistical way of thinking or what have you, what's happened is an increasing fragmentation of belief, where more people are believing in different kinds of things, and some people think that other people's beliefs are silly, and so they call them sometimes superstition or magic. And those categories, fragmentation of belief and increasingly calling each other's beliefs superstitious, also go together. For instance, plenty of folks believe in, for instance, that demons are real and that the people who claim that they see aliens are really seeing demons. But the people who believe that aliens are real think that the people who believe that there really are such things are demons are often misguided and fanatical. So what we start to have in a period of increasing belief fragmentation is a tendency for more people to call each other's beliefs superstitious or false. So I think that's the broader trajectory we're seeing. And there's a separate question, which you also touched on, and which I don't really address in the book, which is why didn't secularization or the rise of contemporary educational systems lead toward disenchantment? And it's very clear that there's a kind of set of unmet needs, but it's unclear. We could try and figure out what those are, and there are different ways to phrase those or to formulate those. And I certainly don't want to say, there are a lot of questions about what's going on. But the main thing I was doing in that book was trying to undercut a narrative that thought that we were just going to get more rational over time, or that a notion about what made the West different from the rest. There was this old narrative that suggested that what made Europe and industrialized, North America and other parts of the industrialized world different from the rest of the world is that this part of the world was supposed to become disenchanted, and usually it was pegged to a time period beginning in the mid-19th century and going to the present. But it turned out that actually, the majority of people on the planet believe in spirits today, and they believed in spirits arguably depending on how the word is used in the 19th century as well. And the very period in which the West was supposed to have undergone a dramatic quote-unquote disenchantment is the same period where you have the rise of spiritualism and table turning, the Theosophical Society, occultism, and other people trying to grab the very notion of magic for themselves and to change its meaning in one way or the other. And so what I would say is that even the very diagnosis of the West as a disenchanted world or a place where God has died, instead of being a self-fulfilling prophecy, has often been a self-refuting prophecy and has led people to go looking for the missing magic or the missing religiosity, or for different ways to suture what was seen as the gap between religion and science, for instance. So all of those things. So anyway, so that's the period that I covered in that book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like that in that book, kind of as you just touched on there at the end, that the kind of myth was that one would see in an enchanted world just become a more rationalistic world, and actually you're kind of finding kind of just something ephemeral there. Actually, you're not going to find how we became disenchanted because it never kind of happened, and then it's like, why this narrative, and that's why do you think there is that narrative then? I mean, partly we talked a bit about it. It's like maybe one think would actually, and maybe for good reasons, think it is a good thing if we became all more rationalistic and didn't believe in these kind of spiritual powers. But maybe there's just innate biological factors that mean that can't happen. But who benefits from kind of espousing that kind of idea that could happen, and why that myth?
Yeah, so in the book I trace a couple different sources for that myth, and one of them, and perhaps the most obvious, is that it fed into certain colonial narratives. So part of the argument about why Britain's empire was self-justifying was that it was bringing notions of civilization and rationality to parts of the world that were supposed to be quote unquote backward, often in ways that were distorting because both misunderstanding indigenous belief systems, but also misrepresenting what had been going on in Europe. So that so part of it is that, but that isn't even close to the whole story. Part of it was, some people were pushing notions of disenchantment because they had ideas about what science meant, and had internalized notions of a kind of scientific mechanism that were actually just about to be challenged in various particular ways. But we could talk more or less imminently to science in a moment. But let's just say an image of science that took hold in the 19th century and early 20th century. And so some people were trying to push it. They were saying, we should strip away belief in spirits and ghosts and what have you. And we need to be more modern. We need to be more rational. And we're uniting those two notions together. But even as the notion of rationality was being hedged or defined in very particular ways. But a third and significant group that I explore in the book was a kind of melancholy narrative. People who thought that they were living in worlds that were in some ways felt meaningless to them, felt unsatisfactory. And so they were describing disenchantment even as they were invested in or nostalgic for either a kind of imagined past where the world was more wondrous than it was, or what have you. And part of it, this too, is a backward distortion. So one of the things, and this is why I'm sort of hedging the notion of magic when I talk about it with contemporary audiences, what late medieval Europeans meant by magic is very, very different than what we imagine that medieval people meant by magic. So part of it was a backward production of a notion of the Middle Ages, for instance, where there are assumptions about rationality that weren't true. There are assumptions about the relationship between quote unquote religion and science, which had not actually yet been differentiated, that are then projected backward. And what have you, in ways that some people articulated, in various ways nostalgically. And so, concretely, the medieval Europeans, for instance, never really thought that the world was flat. And so this, we're recently passing what those of, me and my friends call Indigenous Peoples Day, but other people call Columbus Day. And we'll note that Columbus didn't uniquely discover that the world was round. People knew that the world was round. In his period, the issue was that he miscalculated the size of the globe and thought it was much smaller than it was. So he thought he could set off and get all the way to India. And people, basically folks at the University of Salamanca and elsewhere told him, no, your calculations are all wrong. And he was like, Pshaw, I've got the money, I'm going to do it. So it wasn't, but then in the 19th century, we got the idea of backward medievals who believed that the world was flat and saw magic here or there. I notice it says I'm having an unstable internet connection, so let me know if I chunk out. But anyway, so a past was invented as well as a future. And I concretely locate this in a series of moments beginning at the dawn of the 19th century and looking in the lives of the most famous theorists of disenchantment. And I show how many of them, not all of them, but many of them were actually interested in and engaged in things like spiritualism, theosophy, and magic. And I do that from looking at their diaries and letters and other kinds of archival sources. So, for instance, to take us back to Max Weber, the German sociologist, he famously coined this phrase, die Entzauberung der Welt, often translated as the disenchantment of the world, but more literally the demagicking of the world. And the surprise is that he came to that expression not from, contemplating a dry physics seminar or something, but from vacationing at a neo-pagan commune. And he had himself a kind of longing for what he imagined was a world pregnant with different kinds of meaning. And so in that respect, so anyway, so those are some of the sources of this narrative. But I think that another piece of it too is, there are more pieces we could go into depending on how granularly we wanted to get into the details. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. I really find it fascinating that there was a kind of longing and a kind of almost prescribing an anecdote for their own meaninglessness. Like, I kind of want something which is like not exactly what these guys were thinking about in the past, but that it's like not necessarily inaccurate when they describe their own experience, and the fact that they developed that kind of mythology, that we have kind of left that world, because in a way that kind of still feels genuine, that they're pointing to something real. So as you kind of say that makes me kind of better understand how it's kind of reasonable that there would be this kind of myth, like that world has gone, and it's like, hey, what can we do about it? We're kind of entering maybe a new age of rationality. But then to kind of see, well, for example, and then like it's interesting, we talk about maybe people in the Middle Ages didn't actually think the world was flat, but then there's some way in which they also conceived of the world differently to us, right? So it's like in what manner that, so why did that, for example, specifically develop? What is the reason for there's some different way in which that way of seeing the world gives you a different perspective on it, and whereas for us it's literally not the case. Like, some physical sense, the world isn't flat, but maybe there's a reason why I'm kind of
and ironically, and ironically, we have more flat earthers today than we did in the Middle Ages, because there's a significant conspiracy movement. So, in a similar way, I do think, and I don't want to be too dismissive, that there are a lot of unmet needs that come with things like, let's say that we could call them byproducts of secularization, or we could call them byproducts of a certain kind of globalization or certain forms of late-stage capitalism. And so, people, and then, in the contemporary period of rapid anthropogenic climate change, there are ways in which people's sense of our relationship to the natural environment is, is necessarily, we're looking for new connections and new ways of understanding our connection to the environment. And so all of these are, legitimate reasons that people might want to look at something and might, yeah. So there are a range of unmet needs, and there are different places that people could go for those. And then what happened in terms of the Middle Ages and the back projection of the Middle Ages was that basically in the 19th century, there was a series of conversations around notions about what made Europe distinctive, about what was the relationship between different kinds of Christian confessions, in which there was a famous text by a man named Draper in the mid-19th century called The Conflict Between Religion and Science. But what he and many of his fellows were actually doing was pushing the notion that Protestantism was actually compatible with science, but Catholicism wasn't. But in works like that one, they invented an idea of a superstitious Middle Ages where everybody had all sorts of, incredibly irrational beliefs or what have you. And so part of that they back projected. They also, the idea that, for instance, that witch burning is medieval, whereas in actuality, most of the witches that were killed in what we would have to call the early modern period if we were serious historians, but basically in the period of the 16th century through the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. So witch killing isn't something that was a central feature of the High Middle Ages, for instance. So there are a lot of different things going on, but that's part of the invention of the Middle Ages. And in addition to the invention of the Middle Ages, there was also an invention of the savage, quote unquote. And this was a figure that was heavily involved in polemics in and around colonialism, but then also became nostalgized in the period after Europeans took colonial possession of much of the world. So, we can see the birth in the 18th century of the figure of the Rousseauian savage, the idea that there is indigenous peoples out there who who are at home with nature and whose lives represent more primordial and authentic forms of communication. And ironically, there are two things going on. One, there are indigenous peoples in many parts of the globe were a lot better off in certain respects before colonialism came in and killed a bunch of people and took their land, right? But on the other hand, there was a notion back projected in a way with the rose-colored glasses that projected European concerns onto the past. For instance, the notion of nature itself, which was a product of a particular medieval theological history that merged a Latin notion of lex naturalis, so like the laws of nature, with a Greek notion of physis, or a productive nature, and created this idea of a world that was both differentiated from the human, but the human is included in it, called the natural, and in which the cultural and the natural are distinguished, and in which the natural and the supernatural are distinguished, and in which the natural acts according to laws, which are somehow divine laws, but also the laws of nature. That's a very specific cultural construct that emerges initially from the 13th century revival of Aristotle, but then gets carried forward and becomes a significant impetus behind what will become the scientific revolution. And but most of the rest of the world, nowhere in the rest of the world was this particular idea of nature articulated. And so, the nature to which we see ourselves exiled and want to return to, that's a broadly biblical thing that is being projected onto other parts of the world. At the same time, we might say, as the Europeans were doing incredible amounts of environmental damage due to colonialism and industrialization. So, all that is to say, there are certain ironies built into the history of these things that suggest why, there's certain unmet needs, basically, and why we might want to render contingent or think about the historical specificity of some of our presumed ideas. Yeah.
Now, I really like, for example, thinking about culture, nature, and the supernatural, these kind of dichotomies, trichotomies that we kind of, it's not that it's not true, but it's kind of a bit arbitrary, and once you start seeing the world through that lens, the world conforms to that, so then you can kind of start saying that culture is completely different from nature. Or I was talking to a philosopher recently about the change from the natural to the supernatural, and kind of why that comes about, and from our perspective, then we kind of, atheists will then see it like we see it as a divide, right? And like, how can we, how we bridge them? Atheists might go, well, we don't need the supernatural anymore. And by definition, you're saying it's above the natural. Is it therefore superfluous? Was it, whereas the kind of history of it is like, it wasn't like they were completely separate things kind of initially, and it's kind of conceptual and it's not less, and it might be helpful to help us think about different categories. Like for example, that specifically, I wondered, do you think that's to do with science and the power of that, and trying to have a realm in which science makes sense, and then what can and what can't it sort of peer into? And it's like, I wonder why these kind of, you kind of alluded to it, but tell me more about why these kind of dichotomies occur.
Yeah, so there are a couple of them, and they're both easy to unravel if you push too hard into them, or at least easy to historicize. So one of them is a nature-culture opposition that presumes that there's a distinction between the natural, which is often seen as the real, and the cultural, which is often seen as socially constructed. This is very specific to a very narrow period of European history. And there's a famous book by Bruno Latour called "We Have Never Been Modern," which talks about how that particular nature-culture distinction was artificial, and that even in the very moment it was being produced, there were all these hybrids forming. And how that there's a kind of anthropocentrism, for instance, and I've elaborated on this point, built into that notion as well. I'm also thinking of the work of Philip Descola for those of your listeners who might be interested in anthropology. And in this idea that it ignores things like the transmission of bird songs over generations, or the ways that insects can develop learned behaviors and can communicate them to others, or whatever. And it also presumes, it ignores the way that our environment, our multi-species environment, has shaped both human bodies and been shaped by human actions. So that's one that we might note has, is both bad analytically because it actually impedes science. So one of the things that has made, for instance, and I make this argument in my book, the third book, Metamodernism, the Future of Theory, but our notion of communication and language has been impeded by certain notions of anthropocentrism that assume that all the features of human language are unique to humans. And there are maybe, I'm not saying that there are no features unique to human languages before somebody jumps on me, but I'm just noting that if we think about human sign communication as on a spectrum with our more closely related kin, from chimpanzees to any other kind of animal, social animal, we can start to, it gives us a different way to look at language and how it works and operates, and its connection to, it solves certain kinds of philosophical problems around the notion of reference and communication and semantics that only philosophers of language like myself are really worried about. But I think anyway, all that is to say, the nature-culture binary is actually bad for science. It's a posit that has made it harder for us to recognize certain kinds of animal behaviors that are both, and how they're similar to and different from human behaviors, or it has built into some presuppositions about a difference between humans and our environment that just turn out to be not true medically and not true physiologically, and just sort of not good for a whole bunch of very scientific reasons. On the separate hand, on the other side, this notion of the natural and the supernatural, ironically, this is a notion that never worked very well. So even when it was first articulated in basically theological circles in the 13th and in the 14th century, it was. Because the idea is, okay, so if you have God and you want to know how God's related to nature, and the idea is that you start to develop this notion that there are natural laws, the question becomes, can God break natural laws? Because if so, is God acting contra naturam? In other words, is God being unnatural if he does so? And obviously, Christian theologians were like, no, God can't be unnatural, so we need to come with a new term, and it's supernaturalis, as you alluded to, above or beyond nature, and to describe certain kinds of miracles. But as soon as that was articulated, there was also this notion of a bunch of strange behavior that wasn't directly caused by divine miracle. And the category that, there were different ways to talk about this intermediate category, but the most common one was preternaturalis, or preternatural. But it very closely connects to what will become the term for the paranormal today. But it's basically an idea of like strange stuff. Can I cuss on your podcast? Is that okay? Okay, so strange shit that happens that we don't have an explanation for. And so there's stuff that's ordinary and natural, there's stuff that's supernatural that only happens when there's a divine miracle, but there's this interesting terrain of the preternatural, of the unusual. And it turns out that notion of the preternatural, and this is something I have in a piece that's going to be coming out in the near future, so, but you'll have to, your viewers will have to cite me on this later or track it down later. But anyway, the preternatural is the main space that early science forms around, is actually mining the preternatural, not the natural and not the supernatural. So a lot of talking concretely, if we look at the Royal Society in England, or if we look at its parallel number in France, a lot of these early scientific societies were interested in like weird shit, and they were particularly interested in things that seemed exceptional or anomalous, whether it's rocks that seem to fall from the sky, or births that seem unusual, or reports from other parts of the world that describe different kinds of creatures or whatever. And it's in that terrain that a lot of early, what will come to be called scientific activity takes place. And so, but the notion of the supernatural really only applied to a very narrow stratum of theology, and it never globalized very well. So other cultures, for instance, by comparison, I also do work on Japan, for instance, and in a Japanese context, there isn't an indigenous word that is the same thing as the supernatural. There's an indigenous word, fushigi, for instance, which means the mysterious or the inconceivable, and it has certain parallels to notions of the paranormal, or at least the mysterious. It's like strange shit that happens, right? That's hard to understand. But because it wasn't baked into an opposition between the natural and the supernatural. The supernatural was always at the beginning only reserved for a narrow sphere around God, and that sphere got smaller and smaller and smaller. But other parts of the world, let's say in Japan again, Buddhism existed without a notion of the supernatural because it also didn't have the European notion of the natural. Instead, there was like Buddhism, and there was kind of strange shit, and some of that Buddhism explained, and some of it didn't. In that respect, and if you look at plenty indigenous societies, for instance, there was also not a natural supernatural split. And this was an observation anthropologists had already made at the beginning of the 20th century. But basically, if you look at, for instance, the range of groups that are made up the Iroquois Confederation in Northern America and in Canada, there were a number of indigenous ways for flagging the unusual, but there was not, and this here I'm reporting on other people's work, I don't have any of the right languages, but apparently there was no single notion of either the natural or the supernatural. And so all that is to say, supernatural has always been a messy category, and it only fit particularly in a narrow moment in theology, and even then, in different Christian denominations fought over it. So the Protestants often argued that miracles had ended with a kind of a supersessionist moment in which, at the end, what's called the cessation of the charismata is the technical theological term, but basically after the apostles, miracles went away, whereas Catholics had often argued that miracles were continuing ongoing. There are exceptions, evangelicals and Pentecostal Christians who believe that miracles have returned, but all that is to say, the notion of supernatural was always very narrow from the beginning, and basically didn't even cover most of religion, and even then only worked in a narrow band of Christian theology, and was rooted on a very particular set of theological assumptions that only really seemed to make sense for a very narrow stratum of theologians. So it's weird that today we talk about it a lot more than people in the Middle Ages did, for instance, where in the Middle Ages, the devil operated not according to the supernatural, but according to the preternatural. So the devil was a natural science, well, we didn't use the scientist, but natural philosopher, and demons were not supernatural creatures; they were preternatural creatures because they couldn't violate God's laws, and so they were kind of like little airy, ghostly things that had various kinds of things that Anyway, they had particular properties to them. So in that respect, again, the supernatural is a category that hasn't worked very well, so it's no surprise that attempts to anchor things in it don't work because it's just not a very good category.
It's interesting that science would kind of at first look into the strange kind of mysteries, especially because I mean certainly in your work, but it's in a lot of people's thinking about, for example, Isaac Newton and the first kind of scientists really focusing a lot on magic and alchemy and these kind of pursuits. I mean, and especially as well that, for example, Newton finding the laws of nature, and it's not like that would then go, now we don't need we can try and explain these things without a god. It's like it didn't kind of try and impose on that. It kind of supposed that there was a law and an order. Like, where did those laws come from that he's discovering, right? And I bring this up kind of to say it's interesting. I focus on science because it's funny how in our modern world today, science has become such a huge industry that it kind of then you kind of start trying to, like, as if we can completely map out everything, right? At first it's like, what is the weird stuff that, like, we can really put some extra effort, get those marginal gains on the weird stuff, and then it's like now we use science kind of in, like, all different kinds of medicines and, you know, consulting. Let's go to these firms and use science for how to, you know, make people feel better and these and that kind of things. And it's and then it kind of becomes like, what is science doing? To what degree can... See, it's interesting. I spoke to this neuroscientist, kind of philosopher of neuroscience, and we were talking about the fact that in our modern day, we might sometimes treat the brain, the mind, as something which can be completely understood. Like, you know, we'll get kind of the right models and we'll completely understand it. But there's kind of an open question of to what degree can something so complex be fully understood? And again, I don't know where I'm going with this, other than to say it's interesting to think about, like, the different kind of categorizations you can make, you know, to what, because the presuppositions you bring about what you can and can't understand, what is fully rationally understandable by tools of science versus what isn't, kind of then shapes what you think you can and can't do as you then go into the world.
Yeah, and I would say that there, right, there are a lot of historical presuppositions that have been baked into the formation of the scientific disciplines and what they think they can do. And those are things we could all question. And, presuppositions, you mentioned Newton, right? Originally, Newton, spent more of his time, looking for codes in the Bible and doing alchemy than he did publishing on physics. And his presupposition that there were natural laws and that gravity was a universal law was very heavily tied to his theology. And he had a very intense Christian apocalyptic theological project that, I'm not the one who discovered this at all, but but I think any, historian of Newton will remind you. So that, and we might say today, it's harder for us to see our own blind spots. So it's always harder. This is why it can take sometimes historical hindsight or some cross-cultural distance or what have you. But I think future generations will imagine that we have various blind spots, things that we're taking for granted, whichever we were gesturing at. But let's just say, whatever presuppositions we think are baked into the contemporary versions of the scientific worldview, there are probably some things we're presuming that we're wrong about, whether that's about the nature of consciousness, which I think we don't understand very well, or the nature of time, or whether we're talking about even fundamental minor, but seemingly minor, but potentially fundamental things like built into the standard model of physics. We don't know some very fundamental things. What is dark matter? The expansion rate of the universe. Are we better off? Is supersymmetry a good explanation for fundamental particles? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things we just don't know, right? And so, but I think, talking about neuroscience, I think there's a lot about the mind we don't know. And the presupposition that by just producing a wiring diagram of the human brain, we're going to produce all the answers seems from the outside to be far-fetched, but again, I'm not a neuroscientist, and so I did take one neuroscience course in college, but I did a lot of biology, but I only did one neuroscience course. But all that is to say, but there's a separate issue, which is in addition to the specific findings of given scientists, there's the presupposition that science represents a unity, which is, I think, artificial and projected onto science, and gives license to a kind of scientism, we might say. So, people there's like a podcast. Which I don't want to beat up on too much, but what's called Science Versus, which can be a fun podcast, but it imagines often that there's like the host of the podcast, I think she's Australian, will go into something, and then near the end of the podcast, it'll be like, what does science say about something? And then she'll produce a statement. But the fact is, for anybody who's listening to your podcast who's a practicing scientist, science is very rarely definitive. What it actually does is it puts forth, workaday scientists in different disciplines put forth their best hypotheses or theories to explain the existing evidence, and there's a lot of revisions that go on a regular basis. And so, I'm sure we could go back through past episodes of Science Versus and show the many things that are claimed or spoken of in the name of science, which turn out to have been challenged or modified over time. And so it's better to think of, again, there are different ways to use all these different terms, and as a philosopher, I'll sharpen them in different ways in different contexts. But let's just say when we're talking about science, we're probably better off thinking of a process or a series of interwoven processes and institutions and practices than we are thinking of something static and fixed. And some of these, the hope is that many of these processes are truth tracking, but there is necessarily going to be some things are going to be necessarily revised. In fact, I would hazard the conjecture that most, if not many, of the things that we take for granted as scientific truths will be found out to be either just approximately true or will be revised. There's a fairly famous philosopher of science who passed away just a couple of years ago named Larry Loudon, who wrote a famous essay called The Pessimistic Meta-Induction from Previous Scientific Failure, which is basically every grand Kuhnian scientific paradigm we've had in the past has been overthrown, and so he suggests that implies that any given thing that we think of as scientific will necessarily be overthrown. I think he's a little leaning too heavy into the pessimism, but I would say at least a lot of the things that we take to be a grounded science today will be revised. Some of them will be revised, though, and we'll just think, oh yeah, they were approximately right, but they didn't have all the details. Like Newton, for instance. Yeah, okay, Newtonian physics works at certain scales quite well. It just doesn't, there's a lot that it doesn't explain. And but some of it will probably be completely overturned, and I think that's true. And irrespective of the findings of science, there's the public perceptions of science. And I think that's where we have a lot of distance to go, because science is more often than not presented as if it's a single unitary thing, that if its conclusions are always treated as or presented as if they're universal truths that are definitive in ways that are insufficiently humble. And again, this is out of sync with the practices of ordinary scientists, but it's a very big in the scientific communication. And so we can see why that contributes, to loop back to something I said earlier in the conversation, towards a distrust of authority. Because, for instance, if there's a claim that COVID is spread primarily by droplets, and everybody is washing down surfaces to droplets, and that claim is presented too definitively, then when that claim is revised and we go, oh no, it's actually, it's particles in the air that you're inhaling, it's not droplets, it causes some people who, instead of doing what we'd like them to do, which is say, okay, I'm going to change my behaviors in the face of new evidence, they say, oh, it was all bullshit to begin with and we don't believe in it, and they develop a distrust for various forms of policy making, etc. So there's a big gap, and I assume from what you've said that a number of your audience are science-related folks. There's a big gap in scientific communication, and yeah, anyway, so that's one issue. And there's a similar problem that we could note, which is that there's also a presupposition increasingly happening in at least Anglophone countries, which is this really terrible idea of STEM, which is that science, technology, education, and mathematics represent a natural cluster, and they're the things we want to fund, and we don't want to fund the humanities, the social sciences, etc., because the latter are supposed to be impractical or something like that. But if you look at actual job hiring information, for instance, and job satisfaction, lots of people with STEM degrees are very unhappy. Tons of people, for instance, getting degrees in computer science. There's an incredible turnover rate because they're being displaced incredibly rapidly, etc. And a lot of what we need, I don't think that we should be making our decisions about what to do as a society based on short-term economic payoff. But even if we were trying to do that, that division is completely artificial. And I think right now there's some money being pushed towards science communication, but not enough money being pushed toward, let's say, human science communication, by which I mean humanities and social science communication. Because there are a lot of great findings in economics, there are a lot of great findings in literature departments, there are a lot of great findings in history, and a lot of those are not very well communicated to the world as a whole. And because of that, or for a range of different reasons, even the folks who are sticking up for education often are underappreciating the impact of the humanities and social sciences, and over appreciating or artificially presuming a kind of financial utility baked into the STEM disciplines. And again, I'm not saying STEM is bad. I'm just saying, hey, these other fields are also good. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just in our scientific sort of technological presuppositions of what jobs should we have. It's kind of, I want to kind of even point to what more deeply does that say about our culture, that we think these kind of more narrow things that we call, oh, this is actual hard science, and the rest, oh, what is this? Whereas, because at the start I asked kind of to what degree is magic on the rise, kind of because I wanted to place kind of where our culture is, because in a lot of your work you talk about, we've talked about it here, what do we mean by modernity when like we say it's about the increase in rationalism, but okay, wait, well, did that really happen? And then okay, like how, okay, we have new technologies and there's colonialism, but like actually fundamentally there's different changes in categories in the way we conceive of the world, but also deep continuities. And so I'm kind of wondering how to place our world today, and then what the future might look like. And yeah, no, easy question, but
Yeah, so good. So to first track back to what I've said, so for your viewers who haven't read any of my books, so one of the things I was interested in is this notion of modernity itself. Like, what do we mean when we say that something is modern? And the point of fact, what happens is there are a bunch of different processes that people bundle together asymmetrically and often talking past each other assume as definitive features of the modern. And they often put that modern, and depending on which one you're really talking about, you'll put the rupture of modernity in different places. Let me be concrete. Some people, when they're talking about the modern, mean, I don't know, like modern architecture, for instance. If you're talking about modern architecture, you're talking about, I'm just saying this because I'm looking out over a college campus in front of me, but we're talking about certain principles, asymmetry, asymmetrical architecture, form over function architecture, certain kinds of color palettes that get stripped down. But if you're thinking of, if that's what's supposed to be modern, that only happens in the 1920s through the 1960s or something like that. But you might be thinking when you're talking about modern, that you're talking about, I don't know, the printing, mass literacy. Well, then it's going to turn out that mass literacy happens at different places at different times. The Gutenberg, was beat by Korea by several centuries for mobile type, for instance, and the changing effects of mass literacy swept across the globe in different ways, and they produce different kinds of changes. Or you might think, anyway, or you might think it's like capitalism or something like that. But capitalism has undergone various different iterations and is globalized in different asymmetrical ways. And I'm not saying that there's no relationship between architectural changes in the 20s, mass printing in the 16th century, and the globalization of commerce in the 18th century, and a certain kind of banking in the 18th century. But those are all three different phenomena. And when people are talking about modernity, they're often being unclear about which they're presuming. And another one of those, a very famous one, is this notion that modernity represents the moment where everybody suddenly got rational. And so this is a story that I investigate in greater detail in the book, The Myth of Disenchantment, but it's the idea that there was a line, whether you call it the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution or the Protestant Reformation or the Renaissance, where in some particular moment, somewhere, it's always the West in these stories, suddenly got rational and left the old days of superstition behind. And I note that that myth was generated in early 19th century Germany, and then they fought over which place to locate it on, and they were, and then it got globalized basically. But so I don't think that modernity as rupture clearly happened. I'm not saying that there were no changes since between 1800 and the present. There have been tons of changes, huge numbers of changes on various technologies, changes in cultural forms, and so on, right? Globalization, capitalism, printing presses. But those have been staggered, and they've had different kinds of effects, and those effects have not been evenly distributed. So, there's a quote attributed to William Gibson, but I don't think he actually said it. But the future is not evenly distributed. But you might say that periodizations turn out to be not evenly distributed at best. And in fact, the notion of a modernity as rupture probably covers for a series of many, many, many different ruptures, and calling them modernity obscures more than they reveal. So if we're focused on the changes produced by capitalism, for instance, we might want to focus on the globalization of certain kinds of capitalism, but also how capitalism has undergone significant shifts. We might say, and those effects are different than the rise of literacy, for instance, right? All that is to say, and then there's a separate question, which is what we talk about when we're talking about modernism, because a series of movements have then claimed modern. The etymology of modern comes from modernus, meaning of the today or of the now, and that notion of nowness has been captured by different movements that have often called themselves modernist, but have thought of very different things as central. So modernism in literature was associated with James Joyce and stream of consciousness writing in some places, but in in the Anglophone world, but in France, French modernist literature was originally supposed to be like hyper-realism, and so all that is to say, different people have competed to claim the moment of nowness, and those movements are often, as influential as they are and as self-referential as they are, have often been radically incompatible. So all that is to say, so there are different things that define our particular historic moment, and it depends a little bit analytically on what questions we're trying to ask, and those allow us to project out in different ways.
Yeah, and it just makes me think when you say that when modernity is kind of hard to define, and it's not that there haven't been radical changes, and they might even be kind of co-correlated, and there might be reasonable ways to think about the shared concrescence of different things into our time. But it's also, but given that it's a bit more tricky, it makes me thinking about the future is also a little more tricky, because it's no obvious sort of path like, oh, given that this happened, we can kind of tell a story about what's going to happen. And do you think at the moment there is kind of a feeling of how do we place ourselves, the kind of a lot of the myths kind of the past that we sort of like slapped onto the past couple of centuries sort of seem to be falling apart a bit, and it's kind of like, where are we and where are we going?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are a bunch of different places that we're approaching different kinds of inflection points, perhaps. And one of the ones, what's closest to home for me are things that are happening within the academy, in questions about the function of what we're doing, or in the humanities and social sciences, for instance, in much of the Anglophone world. Especially in the humanities, were dominated by something called postmodernism, which again claimed for itself the moment after modernism in ways that often overlapped with it, and was often used as a polemical category against which people sharpened attacks, but then took hold as a kind of paradigm, and that's being shed. And so those of us in the academy, I've been part of this movement, have been pushing for something new, and that is to say that and I don't mean we're a new moment beyond postmodernity, because I similarly don't think we were ever in a postmodernity, but rather there was something that called itself postmodernism, or was often called by folks teaching it postmodernism, that was used as a model or a paradigm even across a bunch of academic disciplines. That stuff was associated with a set of intellectual figures who did most of their productive writing in the 70s and took hold maybe in the 90s, and has since started to fall away maybe only in the last decade or two. And there's I have my own sense of what I think should come next, but in the academy, something that me and some fellows are calling metamodernism, in a sort of self-conscious way, to sort of play with the categories a little bit, but ways to recoup what was good about postmodernism, and which is to say, to recoup a set of second-order reflections about the nature of power, society, knowledge, and language, but to shed some of the things that sucked about postmodernism: crappy jargon, a limited canon of figures, incompatible skeptical dogmatisms that were supposed to have a political payoff that they didn't have, and all sorts of kinds of things. So I have some greater sense that is happening. At least I've been very delighted to see this sort of so-called metamodernism movement and related, perhaps allied movements, beginning to grow and proliferate in the academy in certain ways. It's harder for me to know where politics is going, for instance, across the globe, which seems messy. The U.S. By the time this comes out, we may or may not have already had an election, which is right now razor thin, and it's very, very hard to predict. And have very big implications depending on how that election goes. We're seeing, I think as a whole, across the globe, people are reacting to changing technologies, and I don't mean. And I mean very proximate ones. So things like the rise of social media, but also the rise of large language models, what gets called AI. And those things are having disruptive effects on many strata of society. Combine that with, at least in the United States, accelerating wealth inequality, or what certainly looks like it, and the corrosive effect that has on democratic norms. I don't know where that's gonna go. And I think social scientists, we tend to be somewhat cruddy about prediction, and we're especially, I would be I would be irresponsible of me to make predictions about how that's going to go without at least doing some having better evidence rather than my own gut intuitions about it. But I'll say I think we're seeing a set of challenges. The terrain that I'm most optimistic around is not short-term politics or things like wealth inequality, but I do think that increasing the climate crisis is being taken seriously. And one of the signs of that is demographic shifts such that even left and right in different sectors of the globe are variously, I'm not saying that both in the United States we have climate denial still built into one of our parties, but even younger generations of Republicans are beginning to take climate change seriously. And I think that the climate changes, the accelerating effects of anthropogenic climate change are forcing people across the world to engage with them in fundamental ways. And so even if the US has a political election that leads toward more climate denial here, places like China are shifting toward more climate-friendly policies and electrifying in ways that are are having a positive and big impact. So, and I think the climate is something that knock on wood, people will continue to band together and solve because it's in the world's best interests to make our way out of the climate crisis. But I'm not sure about the wealth inequality stuff. It looks to me like the technology is exacerbating wealth inequality, and that's undercutting democracy in huge parts of the globe. And I don't know whether we'll be lucky and thread the needle there and find a way toward. I have 5 more minutes before my student just messaged before I need to get off. Whether we're gonna, I'm not sure how that's gonna go. Yeah. And I think that's, yeah. So if this does come out before the election and any of your viewers are voting in the 3 counties in the United States or something incredibly small whose votes seem to matter in our not very well articulated democratic process, then, please think about the climate. That's, for me, I think, a very, very important issue. And vote. But otherwise, and I think more broadly across the globe, the problem is we thought, not we, well, actually, I never thought this, but a number of people thought that the way to get democracy across the globe was to spread free markets. This was a central doctrine of a kind of neoliberalism that wasn't completely misguided, but I was already, I'm already young enough that it was already clear it wasn't working when I was in college. But the idea was basically that if we opened the public markets of the former Soviet Union and China to free markets, they would democratize. And that clearly hasn't happened. In fact, what has happened is an increasing, that there's, we've seen that increasing wealth inequality and the rise of oligarchs basically has a very detrimental influence on democracy. And I think I'm very firmly committed to the idea that more democracy is better. I don't think that should be a radical view, but unfortunately, there are people who are working to undercut that globally. And so I think the question is, one of the crises confronting us is, how do we not re-enter an era of corporate feudalism, or enter an era of corporate technological feudalism in which a very small number of people have outsized forms of wealth and they control the political process. It's something that we really have to confront. And part of the way to do that is also to, question some fundamental assumptions about, for instance, how housing and landlordism should function across the globe, or how taxes should function, and even like where democracy needs to be strengthened and how it needs to be strengthened.
If you want to listen to more podcasts like this, then maybe check out some recommended here or subscribe to this channel if you're new. Thank you very much for listening. I'll see you next time.